Welcome. So this will be recorded. If you want to go back and listen to these again, we will send out the link afterward. And also, if you know someone who wanted to attend and weren't able to make it, then they can watch it later. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I have really been looking forward to this series, and I think a lot of people have been. This was sort of a brainchild of Chase, and we really appreciate him doing that for us. Before we get started, I do want to offer a brief introduction and a welcome. I am Marvelyn Granger, president of the NPAT Fayette Prairie chapter. I'm joined by Connie Shorties, who is our Zoom education director, and she will assist us with all the technical issues and watch for your input in the chat. We have a large and diverse group, so if you do want to say hello and drop in where you're from, or if you have a prairie restoration you're working on, to share where that is, it's kind of fun to see where everybody's coming from. A brief intro into NPAT. You likely already know that our native prairies are among the most endangered ecosystems in the world. Since 1986, the Native Prairie Association of Texas, or NPAT, has been working to protect and care for these important landscapes through protection, stewardship, community. And right now, NPAT is conserving over 6,500 acres to provide habitat for wildlife, pollinators, native plants, and for us. This does not even include the private land protected by individuals like you. So locally, we are the NPAT Fayette Prairie chapter, which serves the Fayette County and the 10 surrounding counties. Our members care a lot about saving native prairies, and they do this through volunteering, caring for their own land, and our chapter offers many ways to learn and get involved, including workshops, presentations, field trips, webinars like this one, hands-on restoration activities, and volunteer work at the conservation easement at Elder Prairie and Chapel Hill. By joining and supporting NPAT, you're both part of a statewide and a local effort to conserve and restore prairies. Plus, you connect with your local community for education and support. And I will leave links for you in the chat. And if you're not yet, if you've not yet found our website, or if you have not yet joined our chapter, I welcome you and look forward to meeting you in person. If you are still living in, say, Houston, and you're stewarding rural land, or if your property or your interest spans more than between two chapter ecoregions, you can join a chapter and indicate a second chapter so that you get information from both when you join. And I will also leave a direct contact. So if you have any questions at all, you're welcome to reach out to me. Tonight, we're beginning the first of this Setting Up for Success series with Getting Started on Your Land as our first installment. We will follow with two more topics covering accessing information and resources on April 14th and managing multiple uses on your land on July 14th. This series concludes with an in-person land tour capstone on September 18th based in Brenham. Unfortunately, space will be limited to that one. So if you want to attend the in-person class and the land tours, I highly recommend registering for that one early. I will include registration links for that in the chat as well. As you have questions for Chase, please post those in the chat, and we will utilize time remaining at the conclusion of Chase's presentation to answer as many of those questions as possible. I had the opportunity of meeting Chase last year in a workshop, and I knew right away that I wanted to work with him and bring his expertise to you. Chase is a small acreage program specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension with a BS in spatial science and an MS in ecosystem science and management. He is currently pursuing a doctorate in rangeland wildlife and fisheries management under the guidance of Dr. Gordon Treadwell. And he and his wife actually are both in school with little ones. So I've been there, but I do look back and think, how did we possibly do that? So we are so glad that Chase took the time away from that busy life to share with us. He brings firsthand experience from his previous roles as an agriculture and natural resources agent in Collin County, working on his family ranch, and as a professional background in rangeland forestry and small acreage land management. He's received numerous accolades from prominent organizations. And as I did, I am confident you will immediately tap into Chase's genuine commitment to people and his love for solution-based land ownership and stewardship. And I know you're going to gain a lot from him, so I will pass this to you, Chase.
All right, thank you very much. And let me get presentation up here, because I know as much as y'all would love to stare at my face on the screen, it would help to see the slides so you can take notes. All right, so yeah, thank you. Thank you for the intro. I'm really excited to be here tonight and to be presenting to all of y'all. This is definitely what I consider the fun part of my job. Getting to talk to people and share and educate and just, share the information that I really I'm passionate about. And I know that, there's a lot of passion for land management, conservation, restoration, and this kind of thing just gets me really stoked. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to have this, to work with the Fayette Prairie chapter in getting this series together, and buckle up. It's going to be a ride. So, you know, uh, with that introduction, I mean, goodness, I know I sent you my normal pre-written bio, but having it read out loud like that made me blush. But so I work with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. So for those of you who may not be familiar with us, we're a state agency that's a part of the Texas A&M University system, and we are an educational agency focused on specifically translating what we know in science and research and applied agriculture and conservation, and really directly relate that to the challenges and the questions and what we see going on in the field, boots on the ground, right? And so if for having seen in the chat the incredible variety of you know uh locations people are tuning in from, I would just give a quick shout out. If you have questions about your county specifically, every county in the state of Texas has a county extension office staffed by county extension agents. They are your local county-based experts for that region, for that county and your community, right? So I cover, I'm based out of Stephenville, but I cover the entire state of Texas, north of Austin, and the parts that aren't north of Austin sometimes too. And so, if you have questions about anything you see me present on today, or, if you would like to, I can help, get you in touch with those local offices. But, we are here to help you learn, right? Whatever that may be, in a more, formal educational workshop like this, or just disseminating information and publications, bulletins, advice, that's what we're here for. So now I can actually start reading off my slides. This talk is, getting started on your piece of Texas. I know you'll have to forgive me for changing the title slightly instead of getting started on your land, but I figured calling it your piece of Texas, to me seemed much, a little more literary and fun. But really, it's about just these are, what are some of these foundational concepts in stewardship and conservation and engaging with the property that that you manage, so that you can do what you want to do in the best way possible. And you can have, coming out of this, the goal is not to answer every possible question. we can, any one of these slides could be an hour-long talk in and of itself. But what I really want y'all to take out of this is, what are some of the, concepts and ideas that you can then take and start asking more detailed questions. If and when you go and work with your TPWD biologist, or your county extension agent or your USDA district conservationist, you have a better idea of the kinds of questions that you want answered, but also to think through some of the things that can help make those conversations more productive. Or if you don't talk to anyone from the government or anything at all, at least it helps give you make you better at Google searching. So today some learning objectives. Broadly speaking, I think coming out of this, I'd like all of y'all to have a better idea of how to recognize the history of land ownership, in Texas and a little bit and on your property, and how that impacts where we are today and the challenges and the management decisions you are making. We're going to talk about how to put together an effective plan and how we manage property and how we approach, getting our land from where it is to where we want it to be. We're going to talk about some foundational concepts in land productivity and sustainability. And we're going to, and I'll briefly mention, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm going to just drop a little bit of a teaser on, where to get started with some information, to help you through this process. And then we're going to go in much more detail on that in our next webinar. All right, so owning your piece of Texas, right? We are, if you are in this call, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, you have a connection to some kind or level of property, right? Whether it's, something you inherited, maybe it's something you purchased, maybe you're an A+ volunteer helping manage, maybe you're super involved in managing or helping out on the on the prairie, that on some of the restoration and prairie sites that NPAT has. Wherever that may be, there a lot of these concepts are the same, right? And so really where I would like to start is just stewardship, right? What does that mean? When I say you are a steward of your land, we need to steward that property. What I'm really talking about is the idea of stewardship is just managing your property, and its natural resources to support that responsible and sustainable use of your land, right? So basically, how can we manage the property in a way that it will be a, resource and an asset and, something you can and want to be actively engaged in a responsible manner for the indeterminate future, right? Similarly, when we think about stewardship and conservation, I also like to, mention that everyone's ideas, we all have this same big picture of stewardship and conservation, but everyone goes about it a little bit differently, right? We have, I think when I can't see it now, we've got 50+ people in here. I promise we have, even if we were all managing our property for this same exact thing, we would go about it differently, right? By virtue of geography, by virtue of preference, in the same way that if we might all want to go, eat breakfast cereal for breakfast, but we're going to each choose a different flavor box, right? And when we go through that, it's also important to remember, just because I'm a Captain Crunch land manager doesn't mean that the Raisin Bran folks are wrong or bad, right? And kind of with that too is the idea of land management, right? So when I talk about land management, it is just anything we are and are not doing on the property, right? So any actions, the lack of action, and the planning of activities that all impact the condition or the state of our property, right? Because, and to go with that, every property needs some level of stewardship, right? Every property needs some level of management. We'll discuss it a little bit later, but there is no such thing as a property that does not need some degree of management, right? It doesn't, nature is going to progress along a certain successional movement. That hayfield will become a cedar thicket, eventually, whether, we do so, if we don't do anything. And if that's not a desirable end state, then we need to make sure we are acting or doing something with that land to maintain it. Or if you do want a cedar thicket, if nothing else, you're going to have fences that need to be replaced. You're going to have a well that busts or anything, any number of other things, right? So the absence of management is a management decision as much as any individual choice we make. And as stewards, the relationship we have with our land is, it is a resource. It is something that, maybe I'm planting a garden in it, maybe I'm grazing livestock, maybe it's something that gives me aesthetic appeal. There's some resource in it that I am appreciating or using. It's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to do something that I've wanted to do, right? Maybe I'm going to pick up, maybe I've always wanted to have cows, or maybe I've always wanted to, have a super mega pollinator garden, whatever that may be, right? Those opportunities are pretty much endless. Yeah, within certain bounds. I will tell you that you can do whatever you want with your property, but I will tell you that, digging a pit and, pouring motor oil in it and burning tires inside of it is not a good, I will tell you pretty clearly that is a black and white, don't do that. That's bad. Um, your land is a source of joy and frustration, right? There's a lot of things that are enjoyable about it. There will also be times that, are going to be frustrating. You're going to get into a drought. You're going, something is going to happen. That's just a part of it, right? It's also oftentimes, especially for those of us who are buying into property, it's often the realization of a dream or a goal we've had, often for a long while. And the land you own is part of a bigger picture, right? It's part of a bigger network of people, of properties, of communities that we are having an impact on, within, right? And so, when we think about the land that we manage, the decisions we make are a part of that future of that land. And that is something that the more we think through it, the more we are engaged with it, the more we understand our motivations and what we want to do and why we want to do it and how we want to do it, the better we can maintain that engagement. And the more engaged you are, the more effective you are, the more fun it is. And from my perspective, as a statewide specialist, the more motivated the landowners I work with are, the more robust of a network of stewardship we have across the state, right? And we start seeing these big regional impacts that are just the aggregation of everyone's management decisions and everyone's good stewardship of their property. Similarly, we, especially again, whether you're inheriting or buying, you are part of a broader community, right? Whether for good, bad, or otherwise, you will have neighbors, right? You have a community that you are in, whether you live on the property or you are a non-resident landowner. I think, always like to recognize that we are a member of that community. And that's not to say you have to be best buds or you have to be super social and know everyone or talk about everything. But I do think that there is a significant benefit in recognizing that having and maintaining those relationships with your neighbors, with the community you're in, can be significant and beneficial, right? And it may very well be different than what you're used to. If you're moving to the country for the first time, or maybe, you're moving into a new community that's just different from where you've been, it is different, but there's a lot to learn too, right? And so I think, understanding that, sometimes the way they do things, there's a reason for it. I mean, everything's right, Um, and I think, those relationships that you can build can be incredibly fruitful and productive. To use an example, we've got my family, we've got land in Coryell County, and having, goodness, and I'm not, there are some neighbors we like more than others, but by and large, the neighbor across the county road from us, he keeps an eye on our property when we're not out there. He also breeds dogs, and he's the one who I, got my Brittany from. Um, we've also had other neighbors that when wildfires were coming in, we knew them and we had the trust and the rapport built that when there was a wildfire coming, they gave us the gate code and we ran in and set the sprinklers off on their house, so that, to try to protect their property a little bit, and you have these, it's not the only motivation, but you have a lot of benefits that can come with that. I think, and of course, always I would encourage people, be a good neighbor. Keep your critters in your fence lines. And just remember that sometimes noise does travel further than you think. I would encourage you if going hog hunting at 2 a.m. every single night during the week when your neighbors have, newborns is probably not a great way to maintain a positive neighborly relationship. I say that example specifically because I got calls before about someone whose neighbor was doing that. But it's just, knowing who your neighbors are, how to get a hold of them, maintaining a relation, just an open line of communication with them, I think is a really strong starting point. All right. And so, from there, going from this big high level stewardship conservation, I'm going to start bringing it into this planning component, right? So, to me, planning, land management, and the process of planning is one of the most underrated and critical things that we can do as land managers and land stewards, right? If nothing else, it is the way we think about what we want to do and thinking through how we approach, the steps it takes to get us to our goals, but also how to improve upon the things we do over time, right? And I always see, land management and this planning process is kind of a cycle. You can see it there on the screen, and, like any good clock, we're going to start up at the top at 12. And it really begins with, defining our goals and objectives. What are we wanting to do and why? Then we figure out what is our starting point? Where are we at, right? So if that's our goal and this is where we're starting at, then, we figure out, okay, what will it take to get to where we want to be, right? What are the actions? What are the steps? What are the timelines, to do that? Then you do it, right? You go out and then you figure out, did you like what happened? And then based on that, assessing those outcomes and impacts, then you're able to re-inform that next planning step, right? If my goal is to turn a cedar break into a native prairie, I need to go out, if that's my goal, then I need to figure out, okay, where are we at? Well, we have a cedar break. Is it 100% cedar? Are there little pocket prairies in there that we can expand out from? Because that's going to inform then how are we going to get there? If I have 10 acres of land, I will probably approach it differently than if I have 1,000. And before we get a prairie restored, we have to first remove the cedar or the juniper. Then after we remove the juniper, then we need to either grow established prairie sites or reseed and then move through that process over time. And after we do it, then assess, did I like it? Was this effective? Did I decide to cut all those cedar trees by hand using a pair of loppers or a chainsaw? And if that sucked, am I going to use a bulldozer next time? Up to you. And I think the reason I like to emphasize this and the reason I emphasize the thought process of planning and implementation is because good management today is always, 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 always going to be easier and cheaper and more effective than fixing a problem, for that we made down the line, right? Um, so the more that we can think about, and you can't anticipate everything, right? And I will tell you that, there was always going to be a curveball thrown. But there's also a lot of things that we can understand from the get-go that can help prevent us from making, maybe a, easy mistake and save us a little bit of heartache. And so the first step with that is, goals and expectations, right? And I start with goals, expectations, outcomes because, you know, to me, those goals and expectations, that's our metric for success, right? The goals we have and the expectations we set around those goals are really, to me, the determining factor in whether we consider ourselves to be successful, right? In the sense of, if I have 10 acres and and I want, if I have 100 acres and I think that I'm going to make $1 million in profit off of it, I'm just making that up. That ain't going to happen. But if that's what my expectations were, if I get anything less than $1 million out of it, I feel like I feel like I did not make that goal. I did not make that objective, right? I would say, so when we think about them critically, right? And it all kind of starts with where we are now, right? Where are we now, and where do we want to be at the end of this? You know, hopefully for those of y'all who are, well, if you're on an iPhone, good luck. But you can see, I've got a graphic on the right-hand side of this slide. And I like to use this as an example because, and if we were in person, I'd say, raise your hand. But, if any of y'all have been to the wonderful city of College Station, Texas, if you've ever been there before, you might be familiar that there is a local beverage serving establishment called the Dixie Chicken. And I might find myself someday sitting up in my office. You can see that in the top left hand, that 1229 US 281 in Stephenville. And I might be punching in paperwork for the third hour in a row. And I'm deciding, you know what? I'm ready to not be here. I know where I am right now, but golly, I could use a good, refreshing beverage and just check out at the end of the day now. And so I know where I am in my office. I know where I want to be, the Dixie Chicken. How am I going to get there? Right? If the entirety of my planning is just, I know I want to get to the Dixie Chicken, but I'm just jumping in my car and I'm just going to start driving, just go at it blind, give a prayer, send up a prayer and hope I get there. How effective is that going to be? Right? It might be, right? Coming out of my office, you got two turns. You could go north on US 281 or south, right? If I don't think about where I'm going and I go left and I start heading north, I'm going to be adding a lot of miles I need to backtrack, but but with a little bit of planning, if I were to punch it into Google Maps, like you see here, you'll see, oh, well, I've got some different routes, right? Some common ways to get from Stephenville to College Station. And even within those routes, there are different ways to get about it, right? Maybe maybe I'm really just burnt out on these reports and I want to get there as fast as possible. And I don't want to waste a single minute. Well, there's a route for that. There's that darker blue line in the middle. That one is exactly 3 hours. And so that one is the shortest time-wise. Well, or maybe I'm just excessive, a little more frugal, and I want to take the shortest distance. I want to spend the least amount on gas that I possibly can. Well, there's another route that saves me a mile, and I can take that extra nickel and use it to, play another round of pool or something. Or maybe there's a third route that it's longer distance and it's longer time. But if my goal is that I am not getting anywhere near the city of Waco because by golly, I refuse to be stuck in that traffic again, I can take a route that doesn't take me anywhere near Waco, right? And each of us will have different priorities, right? If we were all driving, we might just all take the same route because that's what, Waze or Google Maps tells us. But, we certainly all know someone who they would do everything but drive on the interstate if they can. Or the folks who they just want to put the hammer down and get there as fast as possible. Again, I like, it as an allegory for land management, it's pretty similar, we know where we want to be. We know where we want to get there, and we all have preferences and the routes we take to get to that point. Um, and I think that kind of the last deal I'll hit on with these goals and expectations and objectives is, really understand who all is involved in that process. I will tell you as a married man, if the uses I have for the family ranch are different than my spouse's. And I would be foolish to disregard what my wife would like to do with the property when I'm putting together my management plan, right? If her whole deal is she loves wildflowers, and I'm about to go turn her wildflower patch into a hayfield, she's going to be a little upset with me. And by a little, I mean a lot of upset with me, right? And so understanding who all is invested in this, right? Is it me? Is it my wife? Is it my parents? Is it my cousins? Is it my son? I mean, admittedly, my son's 13 months old, so his goal might be just to stick as many things in his mouth as he can. But certainly it is a management goal, I guess. But and I say all these things because one, kind of straightforward, it's not necessarily rocket surgery, but it is something to keep in mind. But at the end of the day, having these good, clear goals and expectations set, is what helps keep you interested and engaged, right? It's when you are doing things you love and you feel like you're making progress and you're enjoying the progress you're making and you can see it happen over time. When something inevitably happens, when that drought comes, when, that fire burns through, when something happens, you have that resilience because you like what you're doing, right? If you don't like what you're doing, I mean, goodness knows I've gotten a number of phone calls before of, someone calling me, hey, Chase, I got this property, I'd like to rent some cows. Tell me what do I need to know? I'd usually start off with like, okay, have you worked with cows before? Have you owned cows before? No, no. Have you worked with them? Not really. And then finally gets to a point where sometimes I'm like, do you even like cows or do you like the idea of animals? And sometimes I've had people like, no, 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 I really I don't like the idea of having cows. And then it just makes me think like, okay, well, if that's the case, and honest to God, I mean, if I had a dollar for every time I'd gotten those phone calls, I could at least buy a decent steak at Texas Roadhouse, on their dinner special. But it's like, okay, so if that's the case, let's take a step back and let's really think about what do you want to do? You know, if our livestock a means to an end, right? If your spouse wants cows and you don't, do you have to be the ones to own them? Can you lease it? Are there different ways to go about that? There are different approaches. But the more you like what you do, the more invested you are in the property and in that long-term success of the conservation journey you're on. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, the kind of the natural resources you have, but next in that planning deal is just what is your starting state? Where are we at? Right? If my goal is to have that native prairie, and I have a cedar thicket, I need to understand, okay, what does that look like? What, how much vegetation do I have? Go on Google Maps. How many acres of grass do I have? How many acres of brush? If you're, to use an example, if you've got land and you want to graze it and you want that for your ag use valuation for your property taxes, and you're thinking, well, I got 50 acres, I could probably put 5 cows on that. But in reality of your 50 acres, you only have 5 acres of grass and the rest is either brush or house or water or something like that. You're in for a rough time. So we need to understand what do we actually have on the property? And then what potential limitations do we have? Just how much water do we have? Are we inside city limits? Do we have, other things to consider? And when I talk about the natural resources, I mean, it's a pretty open-ended list, right? But generally, it's like soil, plant community, what ecosystem, biodiversity, acreage, productivity, blah, 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 right? But it's just, what do we have? What can we see with our eyeballs? What can we see on a map? And with that is kind of the concept of what I like to call minimum viable acreage, right? and I'm an Aggie, so this isn't overly complex, but the idea is just every property has some kind of limit to it, right? And sometimes, especially when we think about how property size impacts what we can do, there is a point where that size or acreage becomes a limiting factor. If you've got um, if you've got 5 acres and you want to run, and you want to run a beef cattle herd, you are not going to be able to sustainably manage a beef cattle herd. In most of Texas, 5 acres won't even support one cow, right? So we need to understand that, there is a certain amount of space that we need to be able to achieve certain deals. Similarly, if you want a profitable pecan orchard, right? How many pecan trees do you need to actually turn a profit, right? If you have 80 trees an acre, but you need 50 acres worth to break even on the spreadsheet, you will, there are limitations there as well. And when I talk about property size, and for those of y'all, I'm a millennial Zoolander, got to throw me in there, but when I think about property sizes, and on the small acreage team I work in, we generally put properties into 4 different categories, right? So we have what we call a household. So that's less than an acre. And most of what you see, in that regard, in terms of conservation stewardship, pollinator gardens, native scaping, things like that. Then we move to that homestead size, which is at 1 to 10 acres. So you start having some space. You could do, you can start bringing in, some, poultry. You can really start upscaling that, pollinator garden into like pocket prairie, and you start having space to access more opportunities. Then we have what we'd consider small acreage. So that's 11 acres to 100. And then working lands are more than 100, right? But, and that's all just, it is somewhat arbitrary. But I do think, generally speaking, when someone asks me, what do I consider small acreage? I get it a lot because it's in my title. To me, it's just the point where the size of the property is the main factor in that limits what we could do, right? And that changes across the state. If you've got 100 acres in Southeast Texas, so down in, the Brenham area, you're going to grow, you could have some cows on it. You could do a lot with 100 acres. But if you have 100 acres out in Fort Stockton, out in far West Texas, you can't even graze one cow. You need probably 500 acres to grow enough grass for that one cow, right? So it does vary across the state. And I always like to mention this because when we think about Texas, there's such huge variability in the properties we have and manage and the ecosystems and the climate, et cetera, that, what is small acreage in one spot may not be in another. All right, so we did goals, expectations, objectives. We talked about, determining our starting point. Then it's okay, planning practices, right? And so this is where we decide, if I am cutting down all these cedar trees, how am I going to do it? Am I going to do it by chainsaw? Am I going to do it by bulldozer? Am I going to do it? Am I going to hire my nephew to do it, or a professional crew of contractors? Those all are a part of this process, right? And similarly, starting with our goals, it's what is that order of operations, right? What is that order of priority? If my goal is to, have that, that native prairie established, well, first I need to get rid of the trees. Well, where am I going to start getting rid of the trees? Am I going to do it in the very back of the property that's inaccessible, or am I going to do it up by the front gate where it's easier to get started? Again, kind of obvious, but worth mentioning. And then planning out those steps and stages. I think, and this is where you really get to, you collect quotes, you can budget, you can plan, and you can start putting together an idea of what the costs are, right? When I think of land management, I think of cost. We have 3 kinds of costs, right? The first cost And the obvious one is money, right? There is a monetary cost to the things we do, right? Whether that's diesel, whether it's bar oil for the chainsaw, whether it's getting a new pair of loppers, there's some financial investment somewhere in there. The second cost we have is labor, right? How much effort can we put into it? And everyone comes at that from a different stage of life and a different perspective. My dad is retired and he can put a lot more effort into things than I can sometimes, or, my brother might be in better shape than me, etc. And then but the third cost is time, right? So that time, labor, and money, those things determine, where our availability of resources are and how we choose the practices we go about, right? Um, and then I would say there's also a lot of personal preference in this. I might choose to lop cedar and use a chainsaw by hand because it's my workout. And that I had an uncle who that was his work. When he retired, he went out on the property and he had a chainsaw and he would go and he would sling that chainsaw and cut cedar with a chainsaw and loppers for 4 hours every day. And that was his workout. It was a heck of a workout. Um, not everyone would choose that, right? Um, and similarly, when we think about the tools available to us, some people, have strong feelings about things like herbicides, pesticides, using heavy machinery versus a lighter touch on the ground, things like that. And again, that's one where I don't work for the part of the government that gets to tell you what to do, right? I am a professional advice giver and PowerPoint maker. And so you are the one who determines what practices you want and are comfortable using on that property, to meet those goals and objectives, right? And you might see, and there will be times where sometimes, one tool might be a bit more suited. You can in fact hammer in a screw if you try hard enough, and for some people that extra bit of effort is worth it, right? You know, um, and I think when we think about these things and these processes and the steps and the tools and the actions and the activities, I always say, and I mean, and sometimes I find it kind of overwhelming, but I think to me, it's that, like the old saying, how do you eat an elephant, right? You just take it one bite at a time. What is that, if clearing 100 acres at once is not viable, well, how can we do it? And, what size of, you know, bite can we sustainably and consistently eat, right? Sometimes, one thing I have seen sometimes is, especially with new landowners, jumping head first, super excited, super stoked. Um, but, they go all in pedal to the metal. And then it's just they get bogged down in doing so much all at once that they burn out, right? So thinking about how you can, if every weekend when I go out, if I can do 2 hours of brush spraying or trail clearing or whatever else, fence fixing, and I can just consistently hit those 2 hours every weekend or whatnot, then that's what sets up for those long-term outcomes. Um, and then I also just like for me in my brain, I always like to think about these timelines. What do I want to do in the next month, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, etc. Right. And just again, kind of gives a way to organize my thoughts. Similarly, when I think about things, you can see the little graph on the side there. I promise no geometry here. But it's just a way of, conceptualizing, right? If I'm trying to clear the cedar, how do I compare these options, right? In just a big hand wavy sense, and you could plot them on something like this, right? Is it easy? Is it hard? Is it cheap? Is it expensive? Right? It might be really cheap to get that pair of loppers for $20 at Walmart, but it's going to be a lot of effort and it's going to be kind of hard to get all that land cleared. On the other hand, hiring a contractor to just bulldoze it and, take a forestry mulcher to it, very easy. I don't have to lift a finger if I didn't want to, but it is going to cost me, some money, right? So it's just, again, a way to think about those things and a way to think through some of those processes. Um, and again, and kind of when I think about these tools and these actions and these activities we can take, I always like to say that, there's always, I mean, even in my career in extension, there's always the latest and greatest way to do things, right? Regenerative, holistic, climate smart, all of those are great and, certainly good philosophies on how to approach it. But I always like to tell people, remind folks that good management is good management, right? Whatever you call it, making good management decisions isn't just a regenerative thing, isn't just a holistic thing, right? Um, and oftentimes when you look at them, a lot of the principles are the same, right? When it comes down to, I mean, there's different flavors and the ways they like to go about things and different philosophies for sure. But at the end of the day, a lot of it boils down to we need to make sure we're managing within the means of our land's productivity. We're protecting our soil, and we are going about our land management in a way that we are engaged in that stewardship and conservation in a thoughtful and um, continuing manner. And with that too is one of the most powerful tools we have as landowners and as humans is the old-fashioned Mark One eyeball, right? Understanding when we're looking at our property, how are we looking at it critically, right? Not picking it apart, but just, I always like to ask, especially Native Prairies Association, I'm going to go out on a limb. There's a lot of plant nerds in there. And I love my plant nerd friends. But a question I always like to ask them, is when did you stop seeing grass and start seeing grasses? Right? What is that point where you had this change in understanding, where you are able to suddenly start visually seeing, oh, okay, that's, side oats grommet, that's black grommet, that's little blue stem, and when you're on your property, when does it stop just being land and you can start saying, okay, that's a little erosion gully over there. Hey, that fence is starting to, sag a little bit, and you start seeing and looking and, training yourself to assess that property. Um, and because really, and again, a lot of it is the sooner we can identify issues, the sooner we can address them. And it's much easier to fix a little problem early than a big problem later, right? And I put this picture up on the slide just again, when you look at this, you have a fence line and you have two fields, one on each side, right? Even just looking at this, you can tell there are differences, right? The one on the left has has more biomass on it, has more tall grasses, has more diversity of species. The one on the right has a little bit lower, right? And why is that? Maybe they were grazing the right hand side and they pulled the cattle off and rotated them to a different pasture. Maybe that's more of a hay meadow and they can't, and they need that one species of grass to have maintain the value of their crop. Who knows, right? But it's how we look at things and train ourselves to assess them that really, honestly, it's one of the big reasons why I'm excited for the field trip we're doing up in September. Is we get to do a hands-on, field assessment and eyeball training. That's not the official title, but that's my working one. And then with that is just understanding what did we like about how we did it, right? What were the impacts? What were the outcomes of our practices and our decisions? And a lot of it to me is just asking ourselves four basic questions, right? For whatever we did, when we went through this whole planning process, the tools we used, practices we used, whatever, did you like the outcome, right? Did you like the way that turned out? Was it worth the price, effort, time it took? Would you do it again? Or would you do it again that way? And if you did do it again, what would you change? Right. And it is very valid to say, I loved everything about it and I loved the way we did it. I would not change a thing. Totally valid. It is also, I think always a good opportunity to just understand, and go through that the critical thinking process. And then I would always say, take notes. This whole planning deal, it is as complex or as simple as you want it to be. It can be sheets of notebook paper or $1 composition notebook from Walmart. It can be spreadsheets and a whole online system if that's your speed. but I always like to say, take notes, write down your experiences. I will be the first to tell you, I am an Aggie. I have a mind like a steel sieve. And so if I don't write it down, it ain't getting retained. And if I'm trying to think of, okay, well, how did that deal go 5 years ago? You know, did I like that? Did I like that product I used on it? Would I do something different? If I just wrote it down, it'd be a lot more straightforward. All right, we're almost done with planning, y'all, and then we get into more fun stuff. Um, resources for planning. We're doing, a big that is the topic of the next one of these webinars. I would say just when in doubt, you have a lot of resources available to you. Your county extension office is a great place to start. If they can't answer your question, they can put you in touch with someone who can. You'll see a picture of this extension bulletin. It's a publication I put out last year, or no, 2024, 2 years ago now. That is basically a laundry list of all the different agencies and groups that you can contact, pretty much all of them for marginal to little or no cost that can help you answer questions, find resources, etc. So for planning, again, recap, effective planning sets a foundation for success. Aligning your goals and expectations can improve your outcomes. Understand your timelines, resources, constraints, and practices, and just take the time to remember to take the time to jot down how you liked how things went. All right. So with that, I'm going to take a second to get a sip of my tea. Let's see, and it is bang on almost 7 o'clock. I can punch through this last section and then we get to questions. That still work for you, Marvelyn?
Yes, sir.
All right. So, foundational concepts in conservation and stewardship. That sounds like a graduate class. I promise it's not that crazy. Like I said, first thing we need to do is understand how can we look at what we want, how do we assess what we are looking at, right? And how can we understand what is good, what is bad, what could be better, and what needs to be addressed. And I mentioned earlier, the things that, along with these resources, what are the constraints we have, right? And every property in Texas is different. Even within your property, there will be differences. And the land we manage is the accumulation of all the land management decisions made up to that point in history, right? We are inheriting other people's decisions. If you are buying the land and, you're probably a little more free to speak colorfully about it. If you're inheriting the land, you might be less inclined to speak colorfully about the state of the property you inherit. But there are certainly parts of our lands that we can impact and then we can't, right? For instance, like we cannot change our geology. We cannot change our geology. We cannot change our soil. I don't care if you are the richest man in the world. You are not changing the fact that most of Texas is underlaid by limestone and has an alkaline soil pH somewhere around 7 and 8.5, right? If you have clay soils, you cannot you functionally cannot change them. They're what you got, right? Same thing with the climate. If you're out in West Texas, it ain't gonna rain very often, right? You can't change that. That is a hardwired characteristic of the property. I hope I don't break someone's heart when I say this, but if you are in San Angelo, Texas, I hope no one's out there. If you are in San Angelo, Texas, I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how much you want it to happen. You are never going to grow a commercial banana orchard in San Angelo, Texas. It ain't going to work. You don't have the soils. You don't have the climate. You don't have, the plants are going to die. You're going to get pissed off. It ain't going to happen, right? We can't control that. So again, goes back to those goals and expectations, right? Similarly, the water we have is the water we have. right? The things we can affect are the conservation of it, how we shepherd those resources and those water resources. But if you don't have surface water, you don't have surface water. If you don't have groundwater, you don't have groundwater. If it rains 20 inches a year on average, it rains 20 inches a year on average, right? We need to plan with that and around that. That being said, the things we inherit but we can change are things like the plant community, right? What is the vegetation on the property? What is the current state? Do we have lots of prickly pear? Do we have lots of cedar? Is it a perfect, native prairie wonderland? You know, we can change that, right? Same thing with disturbance. You don't have to drive a bulldozer across it if you don't want to, right? You can go clear the cedar by hand or choose your other methods of doing it. And the land use itself, right? Just because your great granddaddy, ran, 50 head of cattle an acre doesn't mean you have to, right? You can change to goats, you can do other things, but those are well within our ability to change and have an impact on. And I mention this just because you know, focusing on the things we can change and improve is going to help us manage, focus on the things that can get us the most impact for our effort, right? I'm going to breeze through this. I'm sure many of y'all have seen this before on the left. Again, we were in person. I'd say raise your hand if you're familiar with the ecoregions of Texas, but I can only see 4 of y'all in the little snapshot. So, but Texas is comprised of a bunch of ecoregions, right? It's these different, roughly ecological, geographically defined areas that are different across the state. Texas is home to, I think when I counted, it was 9 different climate zones, right? If you're a gardener, the map on the right, you're probably very familiar with because those are the different growing zones of Texas. Trying to grow something that loves to live in the valley up in the panhandle ain't always going to work. Same thing vice versa. You know, um, and and on the water subject, I will be the first to tell you, and this is probably one of my 2 pulpit slamming moments. I'm not going to literally do that, but it is critical that we understand as landowners. In Texas, we are a state that is a state of drought that occasionally gets rain. All right. This is a map or a chart. I pulled this earlier this week from from NOAA and the National Weather Service, going back for the whole state of Texas, back to this 130 years of annual rainfall data, right, across the whole state. And when we look at this precipitation chart, the things that really stand out to me is we very seldom, if ever, get an average year, right? If across the whole state we have 27 inches of rain a year on average, I mean, you could probably count on both hands and maybe take your socks off, and you could count the number of years that we've had average rainfall actually happen, right? More often than not, we are swinging wildly between exceptional drought and an absolute toad strangler of a rain. And even within those, long-term trends, we have years that are, like even within a year, here right now in January, coming up, we're going to start getting some spring rains in probably March, April, May. And then we're going to go into our regularly scheduled drought of the summer, which is then going to be interspersed with some fall rainfall as the cold fronts come back through. Like we are a state of drought that occasionally gets rain. And as landowners, if we are managing and we are planning on rain in a state of drought, we are planning on failure, right? If you expect water to be there, and you need that water to be there. If you need those 27 inches for your property to sustain itself, and that only happens, across this, I counted the dots, and it was about I forgot to change the math, but it's roughly over half the time we are below average, right? I think it was like close to 60% of the time we get below average rainfall. And so when we think about our water resources, we need to understand that drought is a part of where we are and the land we own, and we need to plan for it. Of course, when we think about disturbance, most of Texas was a grassland, and that grassland, had very regular disturbance. We had fires burn through regularly, usually on a 2 to 4 year annual cycle, followed by great, migratory grazing by bison and other herbivores. And that's what maintained most of Texas as a grass dominated state. There's an asterisk to that. That's a whole other talk. But basically, what happens when we remove fire, because fire is bad and fire culture left, and then suddenly we remove fire, we take away the bison, we put up fence lines, and what happens when you have an open field with no management inputs? It turns into a forest, right? That is not the natural state of Texas. It's not the historic state of Texas. Even in the piney woods of East Texas, there's a reason that a lot of that was called the longleaf pine savanna, right? And that's because even in those areas, you could read accounts of the early settlers, driving their covered wagons underneath the longleaf pine trees of East Texas. And I promise you today, if you tried to drive a covered wagon through the thicket of the piney woods, you would not get very far and you'd probably stop very quickly. Um, you know, and when we think about productivity, all of it starts with soils, right? When we think about how we manage property, it starts with soils. Then we think of our land cover. Then we think of our plant community. And our soils, I always like to say, they are literally foundational to everything we do, right? And they are the most basic component of your land that you can potentially manage. These soils provide a lot of services. They support our plants. They provide drainage. They do all sorts of great things. The physical properties of, the structure, the texture, the drainage they provide, and then the chemical nutrient properties of, how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, all that kind of stuff. Our soils are important, and you don't get more of them, right? The soil you've got is the soil you've got, so you need to protect it. There are some practices we can do that can help protect that soil and add organic matter and build back that soil health. Integrating fire and grazing and cover cropping and diverse species management, things like that, can really help restore a soil and invigorate a soil. But the biggest takeaway is just soils that are intact and soils that are vegetated are soils that are healthy. Bare soil is eroded soil, is depleted soil, right? And the more we can do to protect those soils, the better off we are. And when we think about, managing our soil disturbance, there's always some level of disturbance that has to happen, right? And the goal with this is how do we think about it and manage it, right? If I'm going in and I'm going to clear all those cedar trees with the bulldozer, I know it's going to tear up the ground. But if I know it's going to tear up the ground, I can plan accordingly. And maybe instead of doing all 100 acres at once, I do it in sections and strips. I can implement practices that can reduce that erosion. I can reseed afterwards. I can do it in strips and leave filter strips to catch any soil that was eroding. Knowing that we are going in and introducing disturbance, means that we can then prevent the negative outcomes of it. For our plant communities, I always like to say, know your plants. You don't have to be a plant nerd. It certainly helps, but I know not everyone is so inclined. There are lots of apps that can help you with it, but just understanding some of the basic life cycles of plants and how, annuals versus perennials versus biennials, and, if nothing else, what is a weed? What is, which is just a plant we don't want, what is a desirable plant? What is native, etc. Understanding how these plant communities come together and respond to the management practices helps you understand, again, what are those potential and likely outcomes, right? And again, I always like to emphasize too, when we think about native species, native species beget native species. If we want native wildlife, we need native plants, right? Especially when you think about pollinators, a lot of our pollinators are obligate to native plants, right? And they cannot access or utilize non-native plants in the same way. Similarly, just because it's native doesn't mean it's desirable, right? Especially for those of y'all in Southeast and East Texas, Honey locust is a great example of a native invasive species that not many people like. I swear that, the Lord put honey locust on God's green earth because it is proof that you do not want to hug every single tree. Um, and so understanding how all the interacts means that you're able to make better management decisions, right? And you are the one that decides whether a plant or a species is desirable or beneficial or not. Land cover, again, this is how do we understand what percent is, grass versus brush versus water, especially when we think about those of y'all who want to use livestock, this is absolutely critical. Like if you get nothing else out of anything today, please, this is like remember these next couple slides, because if we don't know how many acres of forage we have, right? That could be forage for livestock, it can be for wildlife, whatever that may be. If we don't know what we have, how can we plan the management of those animals accordingly? Similarly, you'll see here a concept called the animal unit, which is just a way to generalize, grazing livestock, right? So for example, an animal unit is roughly 1,000 pounds of animal, eats 26 pounds of forage per day. Right, one animal unit is about one cow, 1,000 pounds cow calf. It is the 5 sheep equivalent to 5 sheep is equivalent to 6 goats is equivalent to 1.1.5 deer is equivalent to 500 guinea pigs. I actually did the math on that. It's 500 guinea pigs per animal unit. But if we know these assumptions, we know that that animal unit eats 26 pounds of forage per day. Well, if we're growing 2,600 pounds of forage per acre, well, that means we can support one animal unit for 100 days, right? Or 10 days, or however that math works out. Like you can use this to calculate. So if we know how many acres of grass we have, we know how many pounds of grass are produced on those acres, and we know how much these animals are going to eat, then we can start to understand a concept called the stocking rate, right? And the carrying capacity, which is the carrying capacity is the sustainable limit to forage production and consumption, right? So that is when we look at that climate graph and on average and we say, okay, even in the most droughty years, we are producing 2,000 pounds of forage per acre on this property. That is the sustainable limit that no matter what, you're good. The stocking rate is how many mouths we choose to put on that property, right? You can stock above the carrying capacity, you can stock below it. They both have outcomes. One thing to remember, all animals contribute towards that stocking rate, right? If you have 10 sheep and a cow, they are all going to have overlap in some of their forage. You can see a little graph, green, yellow, blue, that shows the distribution of forage that, cattle, goats, and sheep eat. Right. So if you have cattle, sheep, and goats, they are all going to be competing for the same grass. Goats, however, are going to, have a lot of browse that comprises their diet. Right. So you can also look at your property and the land cover type you have and start matching. Okay, well, if I have a lot of brush and some grass, do I need cows? Or maybe I can use goats if you have the right fences, just understand that more we push closer to that carrying capacity, the more we are risking the overuse and degradation of that forage and property. I this is a hot take, but I legitimately, in all the properties I've walked and toured and visited, if they have livestock, 80+% of their management issues are a result of overutilizing, overstocking. And that's what it is, and why does that matter, right? It's because when we, are, especially with our native grasses, but a lot of our plants respond to grazing in specific ways, right? When we think about our grasses, generally speaking, they put, in a perfect happy world, they put 50% of their energy growing roots and 50% of their energy growing shoots, right? The shoots, that is their income. That's the moneymaker. That's what's capturing the sunlight, working hard, bringing home the bacon. And those roots, that's the investment account, right? That's the retirement account. They are taking all the money, all the nutrients they're earning from that sunlight, and they are investing it below ground into those roots so that they can access water, they store nutrients, they store carbohydrates to help last them through a drought, last them through disturbance, right? And so every time we remove that those shoots on the top, it impacts its ability to grow roots, right? And you can look, there's a figure on the bottom there. If we have a grass, there's oftentimes in grazing, there's a concept, take half, leave half, right? The reason that is because that bottom half has all the resprouting buds. It has everything that plant needs. It maintains enough leaf area and enough resprouting area that they can bounce back quickly. If we graze it to half of its mature height and then rotate off and let it grow back, roots don't stop growing. It can just chug along, right? It's like, oh man, we had a lot, we had a big, that's the equivalent of having a big Costco trip. It ain't putting you in the poorhouse, right? You're not having to dip into your IRA to cover that Costco trip, hopefully. You can just keep chugging along. But if we raise it down to 70%, right? We take away 70%, we have 30% left. Suddenly, oh man, that's that I have to get a new roof on my house, right? We had a hailstorm come through. That's we're not, all that income from the shoots, that's going away, right? We are no longer investing in our roots because we need to frantically regrow the money making tissue above ground. Right. And so if when we remove 70%, half the roots stop growing for 17 days, over half a month. And if we graze it 90%, so we leave just 10%, right, on the soil surface, they stop growing roots at all for 17 days. Right. When you look at the top, you'll see pictures where, the more we graze it, and the more we put them in this system of having to pull on those nutrient reserves, right? We keep grazing it short. It's pulling all that money out of the bank, right? In that top right hand picture, do you want your native grasses to be the one on the right with those deep, thick roots, or do you want them the one on the left? Right? When we manage our forages well and we stock and manage appropriately, we have highly resilient grasses. But when you look at those and we get another, like on our ranch in 2022, it stopped raining in February and it didn't rain for 14 months. Right? Happens. Which of those grasses is going to survive? Which of those grasses is going to be able to access water deeper in the soil? Which one's just going to roast to death? Right? And that's why it matters, because it's hard to bounce back from that. If you want to make money grazing, understand once you start exceeding your carrying capacity, you stop making money. More animals does not mean more money. If you want more info on the economics of that, follow up with me afterwards. And so I'm just going to finish with a couple pictures, right? So when I talk about calibrating our eyeball and understanding what do we have, what are these resources, I'm going to go through a couple pictures and think, if you look at this property out by St. Angelo, how many of you would think this is a wonderful, heaven of a prairie and a great high quality pasture, right? How many of y'all would recognize that this sucker is lizard licked down to dirt and rocks, and even red harvester ants would have a hard time feeding on it? Because that's what it is, and if this is hopefully this is not your property, but if this is a state that maybe you bought it in or you inherited land in a state like this, it can be recovered, right? But we need to understand that this is something, that this has certain limitations, what we might do. So like with this one, right? We got lots of prickly pear, we got some brush. Is this going to be a perfect, are we going to be able to make high dollar hay on this? No. You got a lot of stuff to work through first, right? But is this maybe really good for turkey or for, white-tailed deer habitat? You can graze cattle in there. You might need to reduce your stocking a good bit, because you've got a lot of, your prickly pear to grass ratio is a little out of whack. What about this one? All right, this is up by Waxahachie. Big, tall native grasses, good plant diversity, lots of fuel, lots of forage. how do we think about these different outcomes, right? How do we relate these with where we want to be or the uses we want to have for our property? And then this one is out in Marfa, Texas, as you can see in the caption. I was out there, this was 2 years ago. When I took this picture, I was talking to the land manager or the ranch manager. 300 pounds of forage per acre, right? How many of y'all would consider this to be excellent grazing land, right? Rhetorical question again. I can't really see all your hands, but think about it. I will tell you that the ranch manager was overjoyed. He was so happy. He loved this because this was a bumper crop. They'd gotten rain. And this is far West Texas where they get less than 12 inches of rain a year on average and usually less. And so 300 pounds of forage per acre meant that, when you have a stocking rate of 1 cow per section, 640 acres, going up from a 100 to 300 pounds of forage is a monumental increase in productivity. All right, last deals, and then we can go to questions. Just remember, at the end of the day, you have control over what you do with your land, right? Not all uses are equally beneficial or possible, but you get to make that choice, right? I would encourage you make a planned and informed choice when you can, and be flexible, do the things you love. Long-term management requires sustainable management, right? We got to think about what are our impacts going into the future? How can we are in this for the long term. How can we make sure that our land is resilient over that course of time? And like I said, keep your soil covered, work with your biology, understand what you want to do, get the information you need to be successful. And there's no one right way to do it, right? There's a bunch of different ways to go about it, and let come into it open conversation, and but it's you do you. All right. And with that, thank you very much. I think I still have 10 minutes for questions if I watched the time right. And I'm gonna exit, and I'll put my email in the chat. That might be easier.
We do have one question already in the chat, Chase, and I just want to put in, by the way, that I think that honey locust trees are awesome, but they're not a nuisance on our property. So I just wanted to go on record there.
Hey, you can have. I will say, it's bodark can be the same. You can have a beautiful bodark tree if you've got nothing but bodark trees.
Yeah.
Dose makes the poison. That's
That's right. I have my specimen honey locust and I love it. All right. So Sven Maseki has a question. He wants your take on cover crops for restoration areas that have been cleared for restoration and are now exposed to erosion risk. And so he's looking for cover crops that are friendly with same year plantings of native grasses.
Yes, great question, Sven. So the first thing I will say is I would encourage you. That's a wonderful opportunity if you don't have a relationship with your county, your district conservationist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They can help put together cover cropping plans for you and put together plans with local seed mixes that work for that area. I think from a broadly speaking perspective, I think when especially when we're doing native plant restoration, we always need to keep in mind a lot of our desirable keystone native grasses take a long time to establish, right? It might be 2-3 years before you see them really taking in. So I would always encourage mixing in some early successional species, right? And so that can be native. Honestly, there's a lot of it you could do. I mean, if you need cover and you need it now, rye, getting a mix of like wheat, rye, and oats and throwing in some clovers can be fairly inexpensive and just get your soil covered, right? And then your goal would be just to simply terminate it, shred it before it goes to seed, and then you don't have it continuing to be an issue into the future. There are also, I think, native options, um, that you can pursue in terms of, some legumes and some of the three-ons and some of the forbs that can establish early and quickly. Um, I would say too, when we think about seeding, there's a couple ways to do it. You have, I would say, the proper way, which is you get a seed mix, you go with a seed company, you buy it, you're spending money, but getting really high dollar, good, high quality germination or good seed. I will also say I always encourage people buy your seed on a pure live seed basis, which means that on a pure live seed basis, if you're buying a pound of PLS seed, that's a pound of seed that they know will germinate based on the tag. If you're buying seed that does not have a tag that tells you exactly what's in it, the germination rate that was tested, and the percent of weed and undesirable seeds included, you are probably buying a lot of weed seeds. That's how we got Johnson grass on our range. So a little salty about that. But great question. And I hope that kind of started tickling on an answer for you.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and we've got a question that is pretty deep, but maybe you could do a broad brush on this one. I know there's a lot to say about the best way to manage invasive grasses. How do you get rid of them and establish native grasses instead?
So, and I'm going to assume that by invasive you mean non-desirable or exotic grasses. And a lot of that, it comes down to what grass is it, right? So I would say broadly speaking, like for something like KR bluestem, the best way to get rid of KR bluestem is to grow better stuff in and around it. I've had great success on our personal property as well as on a number of prairie restoration sites that I worked with up in Northeast Texas that, utilizing seeding, prescribed fire, and, targeted improvement of some of these areas, kind of the idea is you grow the core, right? So if you have a field of KR bluestem, you have patches of desirable native grasses, focus your efforts where you already have good and make the good better than make the crappy okay. But there are some native or some non-desirable or exotic grass species that, you can target some of them like Johnson grass. You can graze it out of existence. It's highly palatable, or there's some targeted herbicides you could use. It really depends on the species. But I think the big picture is the more we can encourage our desirable species, generally they're fairly competitive once they're established. It's just getting them to that point that, start get a toehold in and grow that out would be my recommendation. And I know that's really vague and high level, but it's just not knowing exactly where you are and what species you're working with. That's about the advice I can give.
This questioner said cheatgrass and KR bluestem. So,
Yep. So KR bluestem, I talked about that. I think with cheatgrass, it grows a little more densely. KR bluestem can be kind of thin and spindly, which is why it's easy to outcompete it sometimes. I think the other concept that I didn't mention is the idea of control versus management, right? So when we're trying to control for non-desirables, we're trying to eradicate it. We're there with zero tolerance. If we're managing it, there's also that implies that there's a certain amount that we know that will always be there. But if we can get it suppressed and we can keep it at a very low grade level, then it's not an issue. So great questions.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now, but lots of appreciation for your presentation and points.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for having me. Like I said, this is the fun part of my job. I get to talk about things I enjoy talking about and get to see cool people and, look forward to getting to visit with y'all at our next meeting or our next webinar. Hope I'll see y'all all there again.
Thank you so much, Chase. And we will look forward to seeing everyone again in April.
All right. Well, with that, I think I'm gonna sign off. Connie, Marvelyn, need anything else from me?
We're good. Thank you so much.